The sky split with light. A glowing pentagram spun to life in front of Lloyd as he clapped his hands together, eyes sharp with focus. Magic surged around him, pure, theatrical, and over the top. He thrust the circle upward. A blinding beam of green energy blasted into the heavens, tearing through clouds like a divine announcement. He raised his voice, declaring the one thing any self-respecting man in his position would ask for: a luxury Gangnam apartment. The light twinkled like a distant star. Then, crash! It slammed back down, striking the ground in a glorious burst of magic. Stone and steel spiraled upward as an ultra-modern high-rise apartment shimmered into existence. Lloyd stood at its base, one arm still in the air like a magician at the end of his final trick. Then, his hand slowly lowered. Lloyd sat at his desk, daydreaming, head resting on one hand, the other drawing a schematic with his finger. Energy flickered from his fingertip, cutting across the paper like a laser. He thought to himself that this was taking forever. He wished he could just summon 100 undead workers so he wouldn't have to pay them. No salaries, no complaints, just obedient labour that didn't need breaks. A notification chimed, the system reminding him that if he didn't like his new skill, he could just use a pencil. But Lloyd wasn't about to give it up. As far as he was concerned, the skill was perfect. Thanks to all the points he'd gained from recent events, he had managed to level up a lot of his skills. Things were finally starting to come together. He now stood in front of the mines. The entrance was sealed by a collapsed wall of stone and dirt, a jagged mess from the last disaster. Lloyd stared at it in silence, piecing together his next move. His eyes began to glow faintly green as he activated his surveying skill. The rubble dissolved away in his vision, replaced by transparent layers of the terrain. He could see 5 meters in, just enough to start mapping out a safe path forward. Once the scan ended, he lowered his hand and pressed his fingers to his chin, deep in thought. It wouldn't be enough to rely on brute strength for this. Not with how unstable everything was. And Padong was still exhausted from all the long-distance jobs they'd been pulling lately. There had to be another way. He paused, then remembered the summoning game. He'd been hoarding RP for a while now, no reason not to use it. A few minutes later, the summoning game was active. Lloyd sat cross-legged in front of a small glowing circle, waiting patiently. The magic pulsed gently across the floor, steady and soft. Something was coming. The surface rippled. A head poked through, round, smiling, and topped with a tiny decorative bow. Whatever it was, it looked absolutely delighted to be here. It slipped through the circle and flopped face first onto the ground with a soft thud. Lloyd stared. The creature looked like some kind of snake, small, round-bodied, and almost too cheerful. It lifted its head and beamed at him, clearly thrilled to see him. At first glance, it looked completely useless, but he'd learned not to trust appearances. He asked if it could grow with seeds like podong. It nodded. Then he asked if it had a special skill. Another enthusiastic nod. That was enough to catch his interest. He smiled, curious now, and asked it to show him. The creature's face lit up with excitement. A few weeks later, the mine was fully operational. The collapsed entrance had been cleared, supports were in place, and the tunnel stretched steadily into the earth, stable, reinforced, and expanding deeper by the day. At the front of the operation was Bangul. No longer the tiny creature that had flopped out of the summoning circle, she now worked inside a large protective cylinder, Lloyd's custom-designed shield tunnelling device. Nestled comfortably within, she chewed through rock and dirt with tireless enthusiasm. Her skill: chomping dirt. The cylinder advanced as she dug, leaving behind a smooth circular tunnel. Lloyd followed close behind, coated in sweat and dust, barking instructions as he moved. He glanced back and called for Javier to get into position. Javier stepped forward, sword drawn, standing directly behind the moving cylinder. Bangle's tail gave a distinct shake. A moment later, her second skill activated. Steel dung. Red-hot metal rods launched straight from Bangul's rear, fired cleanly out of her body and directly toward Javier. He was already in position, sword raised. With smooth, practiced motion, he cut through the rods mid-air, slicing them into smaller, manageable chunks. The glowing fragments scattered across the tunnel floor, still radiating heat. Those fragments were later cooled and collected by the blacksmiths, then reforged into steel supports to line the tunnel walls. Javier let out a quiet breath, eyes half-lidded with the dull weight of acceptance. This was his life now. He'd trained for years with a sword, dreaming of glory, of battlefield valour, of knighthood in shining armour. And yet, here he was, in a mine, deep underground, swinging a blade at molten excrement launched from the backside of a snake. Lloyd called out to the workers, instructing them to move the support rig forward so Bangul could keep digging. He wiped the sweat from his brow, the stifling heat and thinning air pressing heavily on him. The ventilation pipe he'd installed was working well, keeping fresh air flowing through the tunnel. Javier told him to go back to the surface and rest, but Lloyd stayed. He was the one in charge. He had to be here. Back in Korea, the bosses never came down to the site. They gave orders from a distance and stayed clean while others got dirty. Lloyd had sworn he'd be different. He activated his surveying skill and scanned the tunnel ahead. Coal. He raised his shovel high and signalled to the crew. They were close. The men shouted back, energised, shovels raised high. Lloyd gave Bangul, perched on his shoulder, a pat. Without her, progress would have been much slower. He turned to the workers and laid out the next phase. Once they reached the coal, they'd dismantle the shield and expand the tunnel for full-scale excavation. But before he could finish, a deep, cracking thud echoed from the far wall. The noise rang out again, louder this time. A low, grinding groan of shifting stone, followed by the sharp crack of something splitting under pressure. Lloyd turned toward the source. The wall of solid rock at the far end of the tunnel trembled, then cracked. He narrowed his eyes and activated his surveying skill, the green glow flickering across his pupils. The scan pierced through the wall, revealing the problem before it surfaced. Something was hollowing out the stone from the other side. A gap growing steadily. The wall gave way all at once. It burst apart with a thunderous crash, sending shards of stone across the tunnel. A giant ant surged through the breach, chitinous jaws snapping open as it lunged straight for Lloyd. He stumbled back, barely dodging the bite as the creature's mandibles slammed shut with a metallic clang. Javier moved fast. He shot forward and slashed at the ant's face, slicing clean through its jaws. The mandibles hit the ground with a wet clang, severed completely. The ant shrieked, rearing back in pain. Lloyd jumped up and charged, swinging the flat of his shovel like a mallet. He slammed it down on the ant's head, driving it into the tunnel floor with a heavy crack. The creature collapsed, twitching once before going still. He stood over the corpse, chest heaving, heart racing. That had been too close, and none of it matched what he remembered. This wasn't in the book. Then the thought hit him. Ants lived in colonies. He turned toward the gaping hole in the wall. From the darkness beyond, dozens of red eyes shimmered. They began to move. A wave of ants surged into the tunnel. Lloyd shouted for the workers to retreat. Javier was already cutting them down. Blade flashing as each strike severed another limb, another head, but there were too many. Lloyd joined him, swinging his shovel into the crowd, but they just kept coming. If even a handful made it to the surface, the barony would be overrun. They needed to stop them here. Lloyd was thinking, going over his options, trying to figure out what would work. He didn't say anything, just stood there, focused. Then Javier slapped him across the face. Lloyd staggered a step back, stunned for a moment, before narrowing his eyes at him. Javier told him to stop panicking and get a grip. Lloyd scowled. He wasn't panicking. He was trying to come up with a plan. Javier didn't argue. He just told him to hurry. Lloyd's eyes darted around. Then it clicked. There was a way. He grabbed a lit torch and turned to Javier. They were going into the nest. Javier, still fending off the swarm, stared at him like he'd lost his mind. It sounded like suicide. But Lloyd was already moving. Javier grit his teeth. If Lloyd had a plan, he had no choice but to follow it. They pushed forward, straight toward the oncoming horde. We returned to the Frontera Manor. Arcos is frozen in place, stunned by the news from the mines. He demands to know, is Lloyd still alive? The messenger nods grimly. Lloyd had ordered all the workers to evacuate, staying behind with Javier so the others could escape. Without another word, Arcos grabs his armour and sword. He tells the man they're going to get Lloyd, now. Back in the mines, Lloyd and Javier stood back to back, swarmed by ants on every side. Javier shouted something over the chaos, but Lloyd didn't answer. He was too focused. His eyes scanned the stone around them, searching. They weren't leaving the tunnels. That was good. But they were surrounded. Javier wouldn't last much longer. The air was thin, dangerously so, even for him. A faint glow pulsed from Lloyd's eyes as he activated his detection skill. He needed to find it. There had to be methane-producing bacteria nearby. If he could locate a gas pocket, he could blow this entire colony sky high. Suddenly, he called out, motioning for Javier to move forward. He was sure something had to be close. His eyes locked onto a layer just beneath the stone. There it was. He stepped forward and began digging with his shovel as fast as he could. An ant lunged toward him. Javier twisted and cut it down in a single stroke. Lloyd didn't stop. He kept digging. Then a piercing shriek tore through the tunnel. Both men grimaced, clutching their ears as the sound echoed through the stone. Something enormous began to approach, its footsteps booming with every stride. Towering 30 feet tall, the Queen emerged from the far end of the tunnel. Her armoured limbs scraped against the walls as she moved, her mandibles twitching. Lloyd stared up at her. Then he turned toward Javier, silently asking if he could hold the Queen back. Javier gave a flat no. Lloyd looked at him, questioning how he could know without trying. Javier told him there were some things you just knew. He stepped forward anyway, drawing his sword. He didn't really have much of a choice. The Queen lunged. Javier met her charge head-on, his blade clashing with her armoured limbs. He planted his feet and forced her to a halt, holding back the massive creature with everything he had. The Queen hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance. Javier used the opening to twist his blade and strike, managing to knock her back slightly. Lloyd kept digging. The gas pocket had to be close. Every second Javier bought was a second closer to finishing this. The Queen attacked again. Sparks lit the tunnel as sword met claw. Javier shifted, blocked, and parried. The exchange of blows was sharp and fast, each one louder than the last. The force behind them would have crushed someone else by now, but Javier held. Then Lloyd felt it. A sudden change in the air pressure. The gas had broken through. He signalled the retreat. Javier broke off and fell in beside him. The Queen shrieked and surged forwards, the sound of her massive limbs crashing through the tunnel growing louder with every step. They ran. Up ahead, the walls of the tunnel narrowed, just enough to give them a chance. They sprinted for it and dove through. As they jumped, Lloyd twisted in mid-air and hurled the torch behind them. It struck the Queen, bounced off her carapace, and landed behind her, clattering to the stone floor. The Queen rushed forward, but the narrow passage stopped her in place. Only her head fit through. Then fire erupted. The explosion tore through the tunnel. Flames surged forward, consuming the Queen from behind. The blast struck her body, and then the shockwave slammed into the narrow space. Javier didn't hesitate. He threw himself over Lloyd, shielding him with his own body. The shockwave blasted through the tunnel behind the Queen. Heat followed, but the flames stayed trapped on the other side. Smoke flooded the space, followed by falling debris and choking dust. A large chunk of rock broke loose from the ceiling and struck Javier on the head. The light dimmed. Then everything went still. Outside the mine, the ground trembled. Dust kicked up from the entrance as a deep, muffled explosion sounded from within. Arcos froze for a moment, then bolted toward the entrance. Bayan caught him by the arm and held him back. The blast had weakened the structure. The entrance was unstable. Going in now would be suicide. Arcos fought to break free, shouting, but Bayan didn't let go. The earth groaned in the distance. They could only stand there, waiting, watching the dust settle and praying someone would come out. Underground, everything was still. Lloyd's ears rang. His body was pinned beneath weight he immediately recognized. Javier. He opened his eyes and coughed. The air was thick with dust. Pushing Javier off, he slowly sat up. His head throbbed. His vision was blurry. The Queen's body was slumped in the narrow tunnel behind them, blackened and still. Nothing moved. The explosion had worked. Javier lay beside him, breathing but unconscious. Lloyd glanced at him, remembering how he'd thrown himself over him at the last second. Bangul was close, lying on her side. Lloyd picked her up carefully. Her small body rose and fell with shallow breaths. He held her close and whispered an apology. This had all been his fault. Then he looked ahead and stopped. The tunnel had collapsed. The exit was buried beneath a solid wall of rock. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. A system alert flashed into view. Warning, oxygen levels critical. He activated his surveying skill. He couldn't see the other side. He adjusted his grip on the shovel and started digging. The shovel hit stone again and again. Behind him, Javier stirred. His eyes opened, barely. Everything was blurred. Through the haze, he saw Lloyd, still moving, still fighting to get them out. Then he passed out. A system message appeared noting that Javier had been moved by Lloyd's determination. The approval rating rose by 6. Lloyd gained 108 RP. Lloyd didn't pause. He asked the system to scan for skills, anything that could help. The system scanned Lloyd. Multiple skills were detected: mana absorption, mana processing, and mana amplification. A prompt appeared, informing him that these skills could now be combined into a single unified technique, one that closely resembled the legendary Azrahan core technique. Lloyd grinned. He clenched his fist, adrenaline still lingering in his veins, and hissed out a satisfied yes. He'd been practicing that technique relentlessly, even after the duel. Now finally, he had a chance to take it to the next level. He pressed the confirmation without hesitation. A glow of energy pulsed around him, swirling before diving into his chest. The warmth focused in his heart, where a shimmering mana circle formed and locked into place. Skill fusion successful, the system announced. Mana amplification increased to 120%. It wasn't quite the creation of a mana heart, but the technique was solid. And with the RP system, Lloyd could keep leveling it up in no time. Lloyd tapped the upgrade button again and again, burning through his points until the technique reached level 10. Another system message appeared. Azrahan core technique evolved. Current form, double circle. Mana amplification increased to 200%. He checked the next upgrade cost, 100 RP. He only had 7 left. Still, it was progress. Earlier, he'd also levelled up his surveying and design skills. That process had unlocked 2 unexpected perks. Energizer, move without experiencing fatigue for 10 minutes. 1 use per day. Latent power surge, triple mana amplification for 20 seconds. 1 use per day. Lloyd gripped his shovel, eyes burning with renewed energy. Time to put it all to use. He activated Energizer. A jolt of power rippled through his body. Energy crackled across his limbs like a sudden rush of adrenaline. Without waiting, he lunged forward and began digging at full speed. Each strike of the shovel rang out as he tore through the rocky soil. The air was thinning. His lungs strained with every breath, but he didn't stop. Using surveying, he scanned ahead through the rock, eyes darting for any sign of an opening. He kept going, digging, swinging, clawing at the earth with relentless speed. The oxygen was almost gone. Then he froze. A glimmer of hope. A small hole in the stone just up ahead. His eyes widened. Was that the entrance? He threw his strength into every motion, his body screaming in protest. The rock split faster now. He was close. The gap ahead was growing. He had to be nearly there. But then his body buckled. He dropped to his knees. The shovel slipped from his grasp. Energizer had worn off. The 10-minute time limit was up. He stayed still for a second, panting, the tunnel spinning around him. Then he activated latent power surge. Mana burst through his veins. His body jolted back into motion. He lunged forward again, digging like a madman. He had 20 seconds. The opening ahead widened further, but the oxygen was gone. His vision blurred. He collapsed. Laying flat on the cold tunnel floor, he couldn't even lift his head. All I wanted was a cushy life, he thought dimly. As his eyes began to close, a low rumble echoed from ahead. He blinked, barely conscious. The wall in front of him trembled. And then it crumbled. Podong burst through head first, beaming with his usual carefree smile. Air rushed into the tunnel. Lloyd grinned weakly. He could breathe again. He reached for his shovel, used it to brace himself, and pushed to his feet. The dream of a cushy life wasn't over yet. Near the mine entrance, Arcos, Bayan, and a handful of men moved carefully through the tunnel, their torches casting flickering firelight across the unstable walls. The air was thin. Dust clung to every breath. Bayan spoke up, warning that it was too dangerous to go any deeper. Arcos didn't hesitate. He told Bayan to take the men and head back. He was determined to find his son, no matter how deep he had to go. But before Bayan could respond, Arcos stopped in his tracks. His eyes narrowed. Someone was approaching. A lone figure emerged from the darkness ahead. It was Lloyd, covered in dust, unsteady on his feet, with Javier slung over his back. The system chimed softly. By overcoming your physical limitations in an extreme environment, your Astrahan core technique has strengthened. New skill unlocked, power saving mode. When completely exhausted, you can still activate the core technique in a weakened state. Arcos rushed forward. Lloyd looked up at his father and collapsed at his feet. He'd made it out. Now he could leave the rest to his father. The next day, in the village, morning light spilled over the rooftops as people gathered in small groups, talking in low voices. 2 men stood outside, one stacking crates on the ground, the other leaning on a sweeping brush. They shook their heads as they talked. Like most of the village, they'd assumed Lloyd was just a spoiled drunk, the kind of man who'd never lifted a finger in his life. But clearly, they'd been wrong. He'd stayed behind to hold off the giant ants, giving the miners a chance to escape, and somehow he'd won. He'd carried Javier out on his back. One by one, the villagers began to see him differently, not just as the useless heir to a noble house, but as someone who had stepped up when it mattered. The murmurs became talk. The talk became chatter. By midday, Lloyd's name was on everyone's lips, not in mockery, but in recognition. Back at the manor, Lloyd was still passed out in bed. The room was quiet, sunlight spilling faintly through the curtains. Javier sat nearby with his arms crossed, keeping silent watch from a chair by the bedside. He hadn't moved in a while, but his eyes never left Lloyd. Then, Lloyd's eyes twitched. They opened slowly. Javier noticed at once. His posture eased, and a quiet breath left him. Finally, Lloyd was awake. The system chimed. Your recent actions have left a strong impression. The people are talking. Your reputation has shifted dramatically. Lloyd blinked at the screen hovering in front of him, still processing. For the achievement of turning around your public image, you have been awarded 500 RP. He lay there for a moment, expression unreadable. A grin tugged at his lips, wide and shameless. He didn't care about being a hero, but look at all that sweet RP.